From a transparency perspective, we've really tried to lean into that. Every subcommittee meeting, every steering committee is online. Any document we've provided the subcommittees is online, as well as all of our town halls, et cetera. And every public comment. And so we've been excited to see how many people have read through those, but thank you for that reminder. It is being streamed. We have Megan here from the Tennessean as well. Again, this is really about a school funding formula from the state and that discussion about what maybe could be. And I want to make sure to reiterate, this is an initial draft framework. It is not a formula. There are no dollars. There are no actual weights attached. It is just about prioritizing, getting to a place where we can provide a recommendation that you all may or may not choose to consider. So
I just want to make sure everything was working this morning. And, you know, my understanding we were supposed to be, and I just want to make sure it was out there live so that we can get as much input from the public as anybody would like to provide. So we appreciate that.
That's wonderful. Thank you. So we're going to dive in, and I'm going to just go through the different slides in front of us, but the idea is, and there's just kind of in red on each slide a discussion question, but it is about getting as much feedback and input as possible from you all. Just going to jump ahead to the process overview and a reminder of how we're working the process. So the process structure and overview is pretty intensive, and it's just this chart. And it is, we've got events and materials. We have public comment and feedback that's come in. We've got ambassador feedback. The Vanderbilt poll came out. We also have national and state experts when our subcommittees have questions. As we talked about at the last steering committee, we will send those questions out. We will then get written feedback and then provide that again so we can post it online. All of that goes to the subcommittees. At the end of every subcommittee meeting, they provide a set of recommendations. We get 18 recommendations every meeting, and we consolidate those recommendations. But I know there was a question that had come up from this group about what the engagement is, and that's on the next slide, so you can see that quantified. We will have 108 total subcommittee meetings. For those of you who have nothing to do on a Saturday night, you can join me in watching all of those. I read the transcripts, but it's fun to see what folks are talking about. I will continue to reiterate the student subcommittee is actually really powerful because those are quote unquote our end users. Those are the people experiencing our public education system right now. And they have a lot of really, really good ideas about what they want and what they think is working well. And they've been, I think, tremendous. We've had 8 regional town halls. We've also had 8 regional local public official working groups. Those are county mayors, county commissioners, et cetera. We have 1,400 people who have signed up to be school funding ambassadors. Those are people in local communities who aren't serving on a subcommittee, but want to take the time to go to their local Rotaries, their YMCAs, talk to their neighbors, their community groups, get feedback. They are collecting that in various zip codes and then sending that to us. And so we were very excited to have so many folks across Tennessee who are now school funding ambassadors. We've had over 1,000 public comments, Twitter town halls, newsletters, Vanderbilt poll. And then for our very rural or sparse districts, we've actually had folks on the senior leadership team in the department drive out to those districts and have one-on-one meetings with district staff and the department, especially because for some of the town halls, it was just a little bit too far of a drive, and we wanted to make sure that we were accommodating any district that wanted to give feedback. So you have those districts there. And then we obviously meet with superintendents, and it's a standing agenda item. So a lot of conversation over the last several months. I do also want to reiterate from a timeline perspective, this is building off of the task force that was under Governor Haslam in 2014-15, and there was a set of recommendations we posted on the website. The feedback we're getting is consistent with that. It is also consistent with the feedback that we've seen in the BEP Review Committee since 2004. You will see very, very similar trends in terms of the bullets of what people think is necessary to support and certainly accelerate achievement for students. And so that level of consistency over 18 plus years, let alone a formula that is now over 30 years old, I think has been really important for folks to see across the state. There is a very clear and consistent set of recommendations that we're hearing no matter which part of the state, which type of district or community. There are a lot of things people don't agree on, and certainly we will dive into that as well. But the big rocks, so to speak, have been pretty consistent no matter where folks have lived, and we'll get into that in these slides. But want to pause that in case there's feedback, discussion, things you want to see in terms of engagement. Additional opportunities you'd like for us to provide, or anything, any feedback or direction we can get at this time. Or do you think you've done? Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Just a question. The 1,400 were those self-selected? And are they dispersed evenly across the state, or what's that concentration like?
That's a great question. So anyone can sign up to be a school funding ambassador. So we kept that open. We can get you some numbers on where those regionally, how those have shaken out. But it is, if every Tennessean in the state wanted to be a school funding ambassador, they could have. So it wasn't a selective process. It was an opt-in. But we'll get you the demographic breakdown. Thank you for that. Okay. We'll dive into the proposal. So I'm going to say it a couple times, but it's draft, underlined, bold, italicized. This is a draft framework, and it is based on the feedback we've received from subcommittees. So what you'll see on this first slide, which is the proposed initial draft framework, there are 4 kind of benchmarks or proposals that people have put forward that have also been very consistent. The first is that any new proposals should not decrease funding to any district. So every district should receive at least what they are receiving now. No one would receive less. That is a piece of feedback that we've received consistently across the state. The maintenance of flexibility. So this is not a spending plan. This is a funding plan, is something that we're hearing a lot about. Obviously, if you are looking at a very rural community versus a very urban community versus a suburban community, they might all have different investments they need to make to support their students. And a lot of the feedback we're getting are suggestions about how folks would prefer their districts spend their dollars. We think that's really important feedback, and we want to make sure that's public so districts can get that information. That will go into consideration for any draft proposal, but the state at this time is not proposing or trying to put links on, you have to spend your money in this way. I think there's a big caveat to that I want to talk about later, which is our educator salaries. I know that's a really significant priority here. So I think that's something we can talk about, but things like professional development, salary schedules for folks, all of that is still driven at a local level. Third is on things that are outside of the BEP. We've got quite a bit of funding outside of the BEP. The idea is to bring as much of that as possible into a new formula so that there aren't a significant number of caveats where when we get the question, and we usually do from the finance committees, which is how much are we spending on education and what are the returns on that investment, on those investments, we are often saying, well, here's what we spent on the formula and here are the other ways in which we have money appropriated to us. And it always comes with caveats. We want to make sure that that is as clear and concise as possible and that we can tie dollars to outcomes for students and growth that we're seeing in districts. And then the last is the local component. We're hearing a lot on 2 things. One is what that local contribution should be, and the second is on maintenance of effort. Obviously, districts and counties, county commissions have different perspectives on a lot of things, but one of the things that we've heard pretty significantly across the state is that the maintenance of effort should not change. That should stay consistent, what that local contribution is, but the way we calculate a potential local contribution, that's where we really want to focus the conversation and still give county commissions and local municipalities a 5-year runway so they can plan out any changes that might occur. So not having that happen immediately. So those are kind of the 4 benchmarks that we've heard consistently across the state on the overall formula. What I want to be able to do now is pause, see if there's any feedback on this, and then we'll go through each of the components of the draft framework to get your feedback, things you like, things you don't like, things you questions that you might have. But anything on these 4 bullets that would be helpful for us in direction. Okay.
I'll ask a question just to stimulate conversation, I guess, instead of just sitting here. So the maintenance of effort requirement, is that consistent in every funding formula throughout the United States?
Not necessarily. So it is, we have maintenance of effort tied to our federal dollars in different ways, but it doesn't necessarily work that way. We have states who do what's called a Robin Hood provision. That would change some things that might change from year to year. There are states that allow flexibility where districts may want to put in a lot of money one year and they aren't required to keep that up in year over year.
So while I'm trying to make myself be a free thinker,
yeah.
I think the group needs to know what are those other kind of options. I mean, you're kind of locking us into thinking that maintenance of effort is the only way that we would do that. If there are other options that other states are doing, then we need to kind of know what those are, because that's always an area of contention of, you know, once you do maintenance of effort, you can never lower it and all that kind of stuff. If there is a better way of doing that, then this group should look at that. And I would say that with virtually everything, I mean, some of the nomenclature is old BEP nomenclature, and I think the objective here is to divorce ourselves from that. So where there are in other states, other options or other ways of looking at it, and maybe the subcommittees are looking at that. I'm not sure I've heard a lot of that kind of discussion, but we need to know what those other kind of options are rather than locking ourselves into believing that our formula has to have the maintenance of effort that we're all used to. And I'll yield to others.
I wanted to just agree with the chairman completely, especially on the maintenance of effort. I mean, we don't allow our local districts to be nimble enough to say, look, right now we're going to focus on literacy and invest more in that because they know in a particular county that their literacy rates are not what they are, because once they invest in that, they can never go back to a lesser investment or to shift that to an investment that may or may not cost as much. So they may shift to math in several years after, or to CTE or something else. But again, once they lock in at that higher level, because they're trying to chase one particular problem in the district, they're there forever. And I think what happens is, and this maybe the chairman was alluding to, is they're hesitant to then make that investment many times at the local level and partner with us, because once they go there, they can never go back. It's built into their budget virtually forever. So along those lines, I have yet to be provided with anything that indicates, and if it has been, I've missed it somewhere, on what is the per pupil spending. When you take BEP, when you take outside BEP, when you take local match, when you take local investment, when you take federal dollars, I mean, what is the genuine number that we are utilizing for per pupil spending? Because I see rankings, I see, things in the news and everything else where folks, can spend those numbers any way they want. But I'd like to see some hard numbers on exactly what we're spending per pupil in each district. And then on top of that, kind of traditionally, which ones have spent more and how, and then what outcomes have they seen? Because there is built into kind of a lot of these conversations that simply more money is going to equal better outcomes. More money utilized well absolutely could, but just putting more money into a formula that may or may not be working, I'm not willing to concede that in itself is going to equal better outcomes without at least seeing exactly where all the money is coming from now and how it's being utilized. So
that's great feedback. So we'll get those to you in short order. So I'm hearing, and we'll get you a list of here's how other states, we actually have that available, how other states treat their local contribution and their maintenance of effort requirements. We will make sure to get you the hard numbers broken down by source of funds. We have that available, and then we'll tie that to when we've seen different growth levels in districts.
And for purposes right now, what is the current equation on a local's ability to match in the BEP? How is that currently calculated?
It's two steps. The BEP contains 4 major components. Each of those have a starting split between state and local, ranging from 70% state, 30% local on our instructional salaries component, all the way down to 50-50 on our non-classroom component. So that's applied to whatever's generated in the formula, and then that is also then multiplied by local fiscal capacity.
The fiscal capacity, though, is what I'm asking. And again, I think I know what it is, but I'd like for everybody to hear that. The local fiscal capacity currently is evaluated, and the equation that's utilized for that is what?
So there's 2 different models that are currently used in the BEP. One from TASSER and one from UT Sieber. Those 2 are weighted at 50%, and both are looking to capture the ability of a district to raise local taxes for education. Different than whether they actually did. Both have different input components. We can get you the details on each of them, but they're kind of longer math equations behind them.
I think it's important to get that information out there, because it is certainly a dated formula.
And maybe nobody needs this but me, but when we talk about maintenance of effort, to me, that's kind of a vague term. So if I could better understand what we're considering the definition of maintenance of effort to be.
Absolutely. Great questions and great feedback. Okay, so we will dive into the weights and bases and things like that. And so this is the feedback we've received from our subcommittee so far. So looking at the bases, oh yes, sir.
I just want to follow up on Chairman Watson's comment about other states.
Yep.
Just even on the components where you got start with the base and weights and direct funding and outcomes. I think we need the information of what is taking place in other states on each of those type things. And of course, you've got them broken down in what you've passed out here. And so each of those, I think we need to be able to look at that and see what's taking place in other states, what's worked, what hadn't, so.
And we will get that for you. One of the things that we've provided the subcommittees is Education Commission of the states, and all the states generally are members of that. It's a nonpartisan kind of policy group. They've provided us, and they have a whole chart on each of these components, the type of funding model, and then actually what the weights are for every single state and how they calculate various things. So we'll make sure to get you that information. I think it's been really interesting for the subcommittees to look into that because there's pretty wide variance on how different states are looking at that. I will say the guidance that we've provided is that we've obviously got a lot of states and territories in the United States, and we really are focusing on comparisons within our regional area as well as the national. But every state treats their funding formula a little bit differently. We want to make sure we're placing that in context of where we are geographically in the country.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Maybe also in context of who has the best result.
Yep. That we've been spending a lot of time looking at too. Very good. So for the base, the feedback we've received so far from the subcommittee, again, there's lots of contributions, and it's been interesting to see the variance in the different subcommittee groups and their focus areas. These are the bullets that have had the most significant amount of feedback to date. No surprise, educator salaries has come up across the board in every conversation. I think it's also no surprise, you all have heard this for a number of years, nurses, counselors. What has been interesting in the conversation is about half of the subcommittees have defined counseling as academic support or college and career coaches. So we've seen a big push in that space, so more in the academic advising space as much as anything else. RTI2 supports is something that's come up quite a bit. We have some requirements in state statute around RTI2. And then from a funding perspective, really wanting to make sure that districts are able to implement on those requirements. I'm going to skip over. I'm going to come back to district specific needs. Technology is one. We currently have a $40 million allocation, but from a device replacement perspective, being able to do that by grade band in elementary, middle, and high school, there's some interest in making sure we can do that. And then coordinated school health we have in most of our districts, but not in all of our districts. So this would ensure that every district is able to have that coordinated school health support. I know that's important to you.
Yeah,
so.
it is. Thank you. The reporting process on how the teachers' salaries, the increases have gone. Have we gotten any data back from that on some of the reporting?
We do, and we'll be able, we'll send that kind of early draft over to you on where we are there. Something else that's on our website that I think has been really helpful for folks is SREB has posted a dashboard specifically for the Southeast, and it allows you to look at comparisons in all of the Southeastern states in terms of salary, insurance, retirement, and what that looks like and where Tennessee falls. I think that has been a very neutral way to be able to engage in that conversation, so we will do that. The other thing that we have available that was requested is we looked at all of our what we call border counties to be able to see what is the salary schedule for counties that border a different state, so we can see what the competition is for folks who can drive 10 miles and maybe have a completely different salary schedule, where that's positive for Tennessee and where we see the most struggle. So we'll get you both of those things.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. On the district-specific needs, what we saw is a lot of variance by district type, as you can imagine, urban, suburban, rural, et cetera, in terms of areas that they wanted to prioritize. As opposed to saying we want to do a one-size-fits-all, the idea is to say there's an amount of funding that would allow for districts to invest in the things that are going to be most impactful for their students. I think one example is SROs versus school hardening. Some folks wanted to invest more in SROs. Some folks wanted to invest more in the facility component of that. And so we wanted to make sure that there was, again, flexibility. It is not about proposals for everything that anyone may want. This is about really trying to focus on what's going to accelerate achievement for students. And we have seen some pretty significant differentials, more by district type than by anything else. This would allow for additional flexibility for those things that were consistent, but they were more consistent by district type than they were by anything else. And so this is to accommodate that level of flexibility that I think is going to be really important for local decision making.
You gave the example of the SRI. Do you have an academic example?
Yes, absolutely. So we have some schools where we've got almost 300 schools in the state that are not funded for a full principal in the current formula. because of how we do ratios. If you don't hit a certain number, you don't generate a full principal. So some of those districts said we would want to be able to have additional funds to be able to have a full principal in our district or in our school. We think that that could be potentially very important, but a lot of districts don't have that need, where they would say we don't need additional funding for a full principal, but we do have a lot of transportation needs. For example, either our bus routes, because we're a sparse district, we have a hard time getting bus drivers. That's something we're hearing a lot about. And so that might be a little bit easier in our urban communities. It might be a little bit more difficult in some of our very rural communities. And so we want to be able to have that differentiation to get kids to school on time. This also allows for things like librarians. It allows for things, our STEM designated schools, et cetera. We have some innovative school models. So those would be some academic examples programmatically. Good question. Yes, sir.
Within the base, I mean, where in here are things like cost of running the school, electricity, water, all the infrastructure stuff? I mean, that would be a base cost that I assume that state has some share of that. So where are those kind of things reflected in this? Is that under the district specific needs or?
Yeah, yes, sir. So this would essentially assume and take the existing base dollars or what the money that we currently spend in the existing formula and bring those over, which includes some of those operational costs. I think a piece of feedback that we can certainly take is saying this is how much money we currently spend in those different areas. There has been some feedback about deferred maintenance, and the cost of deferred maintenance is potentially something we might want to consider in this discussion. But these are the things that folks have said on top of what we currently have. These are our biggest priorities or areas of need.
Well, again, just to push back gently, we've been asked not to look at the BEP and consider what we're doing in the BEP, and now you're taking a BEP calculation and putting it into this equation. So, I mean, if the base salary, if real estate, the cost of that's part of the base salary, then it needs to be enumerated as part of the cost of the base salary instead of saying, well, we've been doing it this way for 30 years. Well, the challenge for us today is that not to ignore what we've been doing the past 30 years and create a new model. And I know that's very difficult to do because we all do the things that we've either been taught or have seen or have experience with. We all have experience with the BEP, so we keep reaching back into the BEP, pull things out of it. That may be well and good, but what I've been trying to challenge myself with is how do other states create their base, ignoring what we've been doing, so that we don't find ourselves really just reforming the BEP. If that's what we're going to do, then let's have that conversation.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit more about it too, because what we're talking about is not calculating it like we do the BEP, the big categories that we are considering. And so one of the things that we have considered is that if we fund facilities, for example, in the BEP, we would still want to fund facilities. How we calculate that, I think, would be a different way of doing that. So what we can do is we've been working on those enumerations, and we can get that information to you.
Right. So facilities would be one of the enumerated base costs, and then Jack or Senator Leader Johnson's district, because of their population growth, is going to be a lot different than someone else's, which is maybe even seeing population loss. I just think that's important that the base take those things into account.
We'll absolutely do that.
Speaking of base, obviously a massive part of the current base, I mean, we're starting from scratch, so to speak, with a new funding formula, which I think is a great idea, and going away from trying to change the BEP, but really look at what we need in our schools for our kids. And if we're going per pupil, I mean, a huge part of the BEP now is how many kids are in each school. I mean, that's, look, there's levers up and down and all that kind of stuff, but I mean, that's a huge part of what it is now. And it seems to me should be a massive part of what the base is going forward. We fund next year's budget based on last year's numbers right now. In this day and age, I have no idea why we still do that. We know where every one of these children are. We know which school they're in. We know when they transfer. We know when they drop out. We know when they change. A more nimble formula that genuinely does fund the number of kids. I mean, if a school district has 20 additional kids in a school than they anticipated, that's another teacher that's needed. We know that they have the 20 additional kids, but currently, unless they hit a certain percentage in most years, we're not gonna fund them in that year. We're gonna make them wait till the next year and just make them kind of figure it out between now and then.
Yeah.
If we're truly talking about going back and figuring this base out, then some of those districts that are growing, whether they're rapidly growing or just growing a little bit, should be funded to the needs that they have of those students, not have to wait a year and then be funded then. So I don't know the best way to figure that in, but I mean, surely to goodness, since I know that we can pull a report right now and you can tell me exactly how many schools have how many kids on any given day and which kids those are. Technology's come a long way since we first started the DEP formula.
And
And I think-
yes, ma'am.
Well, I think too, that works better for growth areas than it does for areas that are losing students. You can add money, pretty quickly, but just because your students, you've lost 20 or 30 students in the school, to Senator's point, the electricity costs are still the same, the maintenance is still the same, the buildings just still has to be repaired or replaced or whatever. So that to me creates there's a difficulty there, just the money following the students, okay, but the buildings, you have to recognize the fact that there are fixed capital costs with these buildings and the maintenance. And so how do we take care of that?
And I agree with my chairman. I mean, figuring that out on how you create true base cost and then true nimbleness to fund the teachers and the support staff and everything else that are there for more students. I mean, trying to go with that is, if we're going per pupil, which again, is a good idea.
I appreciate both of those comments, and especially I'll take an example. Iowa's an example of how they've dealt with this. And so there are some trade-offs here. One is, and I'm hearing this, and I think I've heard this a couple of conversations, is the idea that we need to have really good data on which students are enrolled in which schools on a monthly basis. The second conversation is really about, do we want to fund this year or do we want to continue to fund from last year for the current year? If we are moving into a same year model, which a number of states do, a couple of considerations that I would love for us to discuss or get feedback on is, one, if there are changes, those are real-time changes. So if I'm a district and I set my budget in the fall or winter of the prior year, and now I have an unexpected loss in students, what are the changes that we would expect? In Iowa, what they do is they do a hold harmless. Now that is then you are giving money to a district for students that are not enrolled, but for the expectation of what those costs would be. In other states, what they do is they delay payment, but, and I don't necessarily suggest that from a budgeting perspective, but they delay payment 2 or 3 months in order for districts to be able to plan, and then they shore up at the end of the year. That's really hard from a budgeting perspective for districts that are really tight from a fiscal capacity. So there are a number of districts that do some things. I think the consideration would be, for those districts who might lose students, what are the ways that we would want to ensure or not that they have some kind of expected budget or minimum that they can plan from. And I think secondly, to the really important point, some fixed costs that you can lose 10 students from a building, but the light bill is not going to change. I think that's also really important. Or with the ratios that we have for teachers, that's not part of the formula, but a 1 to 20 class size, you lose 2 or 3 students, you still have a full-time teacher who's needed in that classroom. And so how we want to consider that, any additional feedback, and we can give you some ideas on what other states have done there. Yes, sir.
Commissioner, do we currently require every school to take roll every day and turn those numbers into the school office on a daily basis? Is that required?
Yes, attendance must be taken every day. Whether that's in elementary school, of course, that's a little different than middle and high school, but attendance must be taken, yes. What we have right now as a process, though, is that we have numbers get stronger and stronger. Districts amend, change, strengthen their numbers over the course of the year. That is something that I think, and I know we talked about this in the first meeting, the expectation being that the numbers that are submitted every month are fully accurate and what we call the data has been cleaned in that month. So right now we can tell you a projection of what enrollment is at different schools, but districts technically have the full year to get that data fully accurate. In order to move to a per student or student-based funding formula, the expectation is that the numbers are fully correct and we do not need to amend them. We know how many students and which students are enrolled in which school every month as the year progresses. That would be a shift in terms of district data submission.
Now, ADM is usually locked in July. Is that about right?
Mm-hmm.
All
Yes,
right.
sir.
So is there any data that shows, like, is there a lot of discrepancy between the previous year and the next year? I mean, is there anything that shows like a pattern, or, I mean, it would be good to see what we're dealing with, because if there's not much of a discrepancy on these, then I think that flexibility could be worked in a little bit easier, but.
It's a really good point. We have that information. We'll get that to you and get some good kind of trends that we're seeing. Obviously, the last couple of years have been a little bit more challenging in terms of movement, but we can do that over a period of time. What we'll also show you is the difference between what districts may say their enrollment is in October and November versus what it ends up being at the end of the year. So you can see what that data cleaning process looks like and how much tighter we get over the course of the year, because it is a pretty significant shift as districts spend time to what we call clean their data. We really want to move to a end of the month is the accurate number. Other questions or feedback on the base? This has been incredibly helpful for us. All right, weights. So right now what we have, and just to kind of give the comparison on the difference, is we generate a lot of funding by ratios of staff or what we expect districts to pay for resources, materials, tests, et cetera. So we have an at-risk category in the BEP right now, which is a fixed dollar amount assigned to a student that is considered at risk. It's just over $900 this year. For a poverty and concentrated poverty, I just want to make sure to highlight the difference. For economically disadvantaged or poverty metric, the General Assembly, as you all know, moved from what we call free and reduced price lunch, where everyone fills out their form every year, we collect those, and now we've moved to direct certification. And that is, excuse me, a very different way to calculate it. It looks at those students who qualify for those direct services. Concentration of poverty is probably the #1 piece of feedback we've received related to weights. And that's the idea that if you are in a school and maybe you have 5% of your students who are economically disadvantaged, that is different than a school that has 95% of their students who might be economically disadvantaged. The resources, supports, intervention, and needs that might be necessary to move academic achievement is significant. And so the idea being that we have a calculation that accounts for that. I want to be very clear that concentration of poverty is actually equally assigned by definition to rural and to urban schools. There isn't any school type that benefits more or less when we looked at some of the data. One of the things we've talked about is having a third-party validated way for any of the weights. So direct certification is a third-party identified way to identify for economically disadvantaged. Concentration of poverty, again, is a Title I status, which is verified through federal government calculation. So we would not, and the school would not make that determination. That would be something that someone could audit in terms of how that dollar is assigned to the student. So that is, yes.
Okay, I missed a little bit of that. So let me go back and restate or ask some questions. Do the federal government they determine the classification? I got that. Do they determine the amount of weight?
No, we will make all those determinations.
Okay,
yes, sir.
now this goes back to the previous comment that I had. I'd really like to see how other states that are using this type of formula, this weighted formula, how they determine that weighted percentage that's added in there. Because
Yes,
for
sir.
me right now, it's kind of completely up in the air, and for you to tell me something or for the subcommittees tell me something, either have to accept it or say, you know, I don't believe it, kind of type.
And we will get you all that breakdown. It's like in a nice Excel chart format, so you can kind of sort for what different states do. I will say every state in the country has some additional funding that's given to economically disadvantaged or low-income students. That is across the board. The federal government does the same thing for Title I funding. The 39 states who have moved to a student-based budget or model for a funding formula, of those 39 states, all have a weight that is associated with income levels. That is also standard across the states. What is different is this concentration of poverty metric. Some states do that, a lot of states don't. But the difference is that they go back to what we've moved away from, which is that free and reduced price lunch form. We've moved away from that because I was not here during that conversation, but paperwork, the bureaucracy around it, a lot of schools and districts struggle to get parents to actually turn in the form. As a result, General Assembly made the move, and I think the state made the move to have it be direct certification, because again, that's verifiable. It does mean that your reduced price kids, so in a conversation with superintendents yesterday, they term it the working poor. So they aren't free, they are kind of the lowest income level, but we would still consider them low income. They are not included in direct certification. So that is one of the challenges that states have been working on. The Title I status then accounts for a large number of those students. So you have a choice, and different states have done different things. You do concentration of poverty on top of direct certification, or we go back to a free and reduced price lunch per student metric. And there's pros and cons to both, and states are pretty split on that. But we will get you that chart so you can see the weight. I will also say in different states, regardless of which state it is, there is usually a pretty heavy weight on economically disadvantaged. That tends to be a trend no matter where you live. Additional supports for those students who are low income, because data-wise, what we see is that achievement tends to have a strong correlation to income. More supports for those students tends to benefit when done well and when those inputs are of quality. In our state, we have a lot of ways that we've looked at the data. To Chair Lady Hazelwood's point, when we see high quality implementation of really strong programs, we've been able to see a movement and more growth in those schools. And so that's something that we will also be able to provide to you. It's just some of those trends.
Just a question on the numbers that are on this page. Since we've gone to looking at more of the Title I status of the communities that the students are in, instead of just whether or not each particular student is falling within those categories. I mean, we have just under 1 million kids in school, right?
Okay.
990 something thousand. Is that close enough?
Yeah, yep, yes.
Okay. So according to the evaluations we're using right now, 569,108 students are in concentrated poverty. And and the recommendation is to weight this significantly towards that number of students.
We as a state have a relatively high number of students who are in Title I schools, and that would be it is high, and that is.
And I understand that
yeah.
I mean, and again, that's in Title I schools.
Yes.
But when we went away from looking at the actual children and the families that they come from, and whether or not those particular children are in poverty, that those numbers skyrocketed. Is that fair enough?
I would have to look at what our numbers were when we did free and reduced price lunch, because that's the most accurate way when we can say student by student what those calculations were. But we see that there's a pretty commensurate number. It's not going to be, 569,108, but it will be pretty commensurate that qualified.
Well, I know it's difficult, and I understand why we might have gone away from it from paperwork issues or whatever else. But I mean, if we're going to look at, the actual needs of each student,
Yep.
I mean, to just look at a Title I school and say, well, we just assume that every child within that Title I school automatically has a much greater need of all of these services that go with that. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not, I don't know. But if we're not, if we're going to look at the actual children, and I hope that we do, I would like to know, what about, I'm sure there are, schools that fall outside of that Title I status, or we may have quite a few children in any one given year that come from impoverished homes.
That's right.
But if we're looking at just a macro level here, then those children are not going to get additional assistance, and those school systems aren't going to get additional assistance because as a whole, that school didn't fit that criteria. So I don't know, that just appears to me to be problematic to try to go just in what's Title I and what's not.
And I would say from a feedback perspective within the general subcommittees, that is something that has come up quite a bit on this definition. We're actually specifically asking for feedback on that because moving away from the free and reduced price lunch paperwork from a bureaucracy, operational costs, et cetera, was positive at the time that happened, but we didn't have a proposed framework that would have looked at it at the student by student level. And I'm actually going to, just as a frame of reference, look at both of your districts for the two leaders. This would be less beneficial for some of your schools and more beneficial for others. So you look at a school that is Title I, it is going to include some students who are not low income. We also know that there will be students who are low income but not direct cert at schools that would not receive funding because they aren't direct cert. They're not in the bottom tier of low income status. They're kind of in that reduced price lunch, and they do not go to a Title I school. That student wouldn't generate funding in this definition. The way to do that would be to go back to some kind of free and reduced price lunch paperwork, because to your point, sir, it would be student by student. That's a policy consideration. I think what we were deferring to in this proposal was the latest legislative action on this and wanting to be considerate of that. Also understand that was not in a student-based formula. So I can bring that back to the subcommittees for feedback on what that would mean.
I think we're back to what the chairman said, though. Trying to use base elements from a current formula instead of starting over and going to a student-based formula. I mean, I agree. I mean, I think we should try to at least find as many elements that, get back to the basics on, really looking at how we're investing these dollars.
Yep.
Along this same discussion, is there an avenue of looking at communities within a school? Whether where it's not the entire school, but there may be communities within, not the school district, but within the school,
Absolutely.
there'd be a hybrid.
Absolutely. And we would have, in a student-based formula, we would be able to look at that at the student level, whereas right now we have to present at the macro level because we don't know how various funding, it's generated at the macro level, it's reported at the macro level or district level. It's really hard to be able to say what that looks like at the school level. So in a student-based formula, we would be able to get you that information and be able to be more targeted in any resource allocation at that level also. So I think that's a great point.
It's a beast.
Yes, ma'am.
So I hear from a lot of the cafeteria workers, the waste with these lunches. And so is there been any look at that, or instead of just throwing the food away, I know there's very all health stuff and all, but if there's an issue with them being hungry at home with that, I don't know.
So I'm going to put my principal hat on because it drove me nuts. And one of the requirements is to get the full federal dollars for the meal. You have to put every piece of that meal onto the plate and show that you put it on the plate to get the reimbursement. So even if the student doesn't want that piece of fruit or the macaroni or whatever it is, it has to go on the plate or you don't get the money. And so it ends up generating a lot of waste. That is a federal requirement. Drove me nuts. But
A lot of schools have, coordinated school health, they've done a lot of sharing tables
That's
where
right.
students that don't use their food, they'll create a sharing table. And a lot of coordinators have pushed that and try to have a sharing table at schools where kids can utilize that, so it's not as wasteful.
That's right. Which is a really good point. And I think something else, and I know y'all done a lot of work on this, but it's the idea of weekends. And you think about students on Fridays who might not have meals on Saturday and Sunday at the same level that they do during the week, and being able to package that, especially for food that isn't perishable. I think those are great practices. There's a lot of good work in.
Yes,
Yes, sir.
I want to make sure I'm defining in the weight comparability, I want to make sure the term heavy, light varies. Is that based on the feedback that we're getting? Is that where that's coming from? Make sure I'm.
Yes, sir. And so one of the challenges is because this is still just a draft framework, there aren't numbers associated with it because we're still just in this kind of development community feedback space. What we're trying to reflect is that this particular weight, for example, people feel like if there is a weight, it should be heavy or a large weight versus a lighter weight. So it's proportional, so you can kind of see the difference between the weights. They're not all the same.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking that. Okay, I'm going to go to unique learning needs, which is the next page. Lots of feedback on this. So this includes, just for norming, this would include students with disabilities. Tennessee, I think to its credit, is one of the only states that includes gifted within that. This maintains that. We got a lot of feedback on making sure that that stayed. This includes English learners. And this also includes students with qualified Section 504 dyslexia plans. And I want to just put a little note on that. We've had a lot of feedback on dyslexia in particular, especially with the state dyslexia law and everything that's gone with that. The challenge is that, and again, one of the components that we think is really important is that we need to be able to audit against any number that would generate funding. And so there's a term in the current statute that says characteristics of dyslexia. A Section 504 plan just means a student has a need or an accommodation, and it is a legal document that requires the school to provide the service. So if you are a student with dyslexia and you have a disability that qualifies for an IEP, it doesn't change that. We have a lot of students with dyslexia that don't generate a special education status, but they still require services in our law. This essentially says you have to have a legal plan. It's called a Section 504 plan that outlines the district or school's responsibility in those services. And that is consistent with what our state statute says. It just requires that next step of having to have an actual plan. Without that, we don't have a way to generate or look at, from an audit perspective, yep, there is a plan, there's some legal binding document, so therefore the school would generate funding for that student. There are some that we don't have that because we don't have that now. There are some kind of perverse incentives, so there's a requirement, but it doesn't necessarily mean all of our students with dyslexia are identified at the pace in which I think the law intended, because there would be funding potentially attached to that and the legal documentation. It would allow for us in the early literacy spaces to identify earlier, get services earlier, and not see those ramifications later. So that was some of the feedback we received pretty overwhelmingly across the board. Questions on that? I know section 504 people don't talk about as much. We talk about IEPs more. I'll give an example that's non-academic. A child in a wheelchair may have a section 504 plan for physical accommodations to make sure they can get to every part of the school. Section 504 can also be academic, and those would be, again, required legal services to the child. Even if the child does not qualify for an IEP, they still have additional services they are required to receive in order to meet the same access, opportunity, and achievement as any other child. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if this is the right time or place that, but with the dyslexia, we have found, I've heard from some parents that had the plan, the child went through it, it wasn't working.
Mhm.
When the parent came back and said, we need something else, they said, we have nothing, but they are marked, the parent refused. So is this gonna help clarify any of that problem?
It doesn't, because one of the things that I would say every district treats this a little bit differently, which is part of, I think, what this can standardize is if you have a plan or an agreement, and it is just an agreement between, let's say, myself and the school where my kids go, that is an agreement that we've worked out. Section 504 works a lot more like an IEP,
Okay.
where there's a actual process you can go through. So if you not agree with the services, there's an escalation process that works in the same way. I think it addresses a lot of the challenges that we've heard pretty significantly, and that a lot of that is just because there isn't a formal process right now that we've attributed to dyslexia. And so we're hoping that this, again, if it's going to generate funding, I feel pretty strongly personally that we need to ensure that we have a way to account for that and audit against it so that we are funding only the things that require that funding. Yes, ma'am.
So are you, I'm trying to wrap my head around that too, sorry. And I've mentioned this publicly before, so I'm not trying to bring, I have two kids in public schools, and my daughter, very early on, I thought it was a victory of the public school system, quite frankly. They identified a coding issue, some mild dyslexia, and, she reads at a slower pace than other kids, and they have addressed that pretty quickly.
Mhm.
Now, I don't think she ever had an official Section 504 dyslexia plan or anything of that nature.
That's
But I
right.
mean, look, she worked with the school nurse, she worked with the teacher, they all knew that there was an issue there. I didn't have to. When you're a parent and you're going through that, I mean, it's very difficult to make sure that the needs of your child are being addressed without them feeling like there is something wrong with them.
That's right.
Okay? She has a very specific way she reads that they had to retrain her brain to. Are you saying that unless a parent's willing to fill out some special form that says, hey, my kid's got to get special services, the school's not going to get funded? Or I'm trying to follow what we're trying to do here.
Yeah.
Because again, our school stepped up. They did a great job. My daughter was straight A's last year. Okay. And I'm proud of her. I got the certificate on the fridge. Okay. So was my son. But the school did it. They provided the services. I mean, what are we saying we're going to change here?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things I want to pull apart. So one is our districts and our schools are doing a lot of work on dyslexia right now, and they're doing that, but there isn't necessarily funding associated with it. So they're doing that because it's best for the student, because they know it's necessary for the student to achieve. So that is happening, and I'm glad you had such a great experience. I think it's wonderful.
It worked.
It works, yeah. And so that is one part of it. The other part is in the dyslexia, kind of in that spectrum, you've got the significant or severe, which might be the IEP, and you have mild. That moderate space sometimes qualifies for an IEP, sometimes it doesn't, but it might be such that it requires pretty significant services. At this time, there really isn't a way in which to address that isn't treated like mild. So it's either you have a disability or you don't. And if you have a disability, there's funding for that. If you don't, it is school by school what they are able to accomplish with the resources that they have. What this is saying is in that moderate space for students who need significant more services, but they're not quite a student who qualifies for an IEP, this would say there is now a process for that. and there is a way in which the districts would receive funding to provide that service that is legally binding. It does not take away that all of those students with mild dyslexia or that can be accommodated within RTI2 in the classroom with some additional supports, they would all still move forward. It is that middle ground that we've heard quite a bit of feedback about.
All right, thank you.
I really appreciate that question. Thank you. Other questions on unique learning needs, I do want to call out some of the feedback. One, this is very different than the BEP. I think to Chairman Watson's point, that is this idea about funding the needs of the student. So when you think about, let's say, an English learner, right now we have a one size fits all. What we have heard from the community pretty significantly is that there is a difference between a child who is in elementary school or high school, who has never been exposed to the English language, who has never maybe even been in formal school. What that child needs is not the same as a child who's very close to English proficiency and is probably going to test out that year. Right now, we fund those children the same. Child 1 might need a little bit more supports to accelerate their understanding and proficiency of the English language. Child 2 needs less. And so by how we're funding it now, it is a one size fits all. It doesn't matter where you are. There isn't really any kind of gradation like we see with students with disabilities. So there's been a lot of feedback about we need to have those different options in the same way we have for children with disabilities. So we're funding the need as opposed to kind of the one size component. That is something we've heard quite a bit about. And then again, with gifted students, we want to make sure that that still receives that funding. It does mean that the child, for all of these, there is a legal plan and there is an assessment. So there is a two-step authentication process. It wouldn't just be I've made the call or I've made the decision at the school level. We do have assessments for all of these that provide that third-party verification. So questions on this. These are some areas that would be a shift where funding needs versus ratios of teachers. I think to the chairman's point, the other one that we've heard quite a bit about is the ratios we need for special ed is usually just on how many teachers we think or how many student to teacher ratio, what that might look like for a particular disability. And that's not actually how we staff in schools necessarily. So if a child needs a child with a speech and language disability, it's not about the ratio, it's actually about what the cost of the service is. And that service might only last for 6 months. That service might last for the full year. And so we need to make sure that we're funding accordingly and not overfunding or underfunding by that. So much more specificity and targeted support. Other feedback or questions here. It was the heaviest feedback area from the public because it is a very large percentage of our schools, second only to, I think, the concentrated poverty, economically disadvantaged conversation. Next are charter schools. I'm happy to answer any questions here. I think obviously you all know there's a recurring funding component for charter schools in the budget now. It's not in the formula, but there is a separate line item in recurring dollars for charter schools. Again, with the idea that we want to bring everything into one formula, this would bring that over into any proposed new formula. So happy to answer questions on this one in particular, but wanted to give the context again. Just like coordinated school health, we're trying to bring things that are funded outside of the BEP and then think about what that topic is, what that funding amount is, and what that should look like in a new formula. So it's happy to answer questions. Moving right along.
I'll ask it then.
Okay.
I think somebody else might.
Sure.
Why would it be included in the base?
This is in the weights.
I know, why would charter schools, I mean, I think working theory on charter schools forever has been that a charter school can do things that are maybe a little bit different than a public school would do, do it utilizing basically the exact same amount of money that's being allocated to the public schools and get better outcomes. Is that a fair enough kind of summary on
Sure.
why we utilize charter schools
Sure.
within the system? So I mean, if that is the theory and we've seen that borne out potentially, why would it have a weight one way or the other?
So I think for right now, what we had looked at is we provide additional funding for charter schools outside of I think it's 6 million recurring and 6 million or 12 million non-recurring last year. That dollar amount, what we're saying is we made a commitment that in this, we don't want, it's not about cuts. That's not obviously for you all to decide. That's not for the department to propose in any way. But what we're saying is charters are funded outside of the formula. Currently, if we're going to have a new state formula, we want to ensure that as many education dollars are in one consolidated place as possible. since the General Assembly currently funds charter schools outside of the formula, but it is a reoccurring expense right now. This brings it into that one consolidated place, like a number of other things.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Well, isn't that 6 or 12 million basically because of the need for facilities? Is that a true statement?
Yes, that's right. So many of our charter schools pay rent. They are responsible for some of the upgrades and or improvements, facility maintenance costs, et cetera. That is going to vary school by school, but it is specifically for facilities.
Which is challenge charter schools. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
yes.
Okay, I'm gonna move right along to direct funding. There were a lot of things that people thought about for direct funding, and I very much appreciate that. But the three that came up the most, the first was fast growing. As has been brought up a number of times, we have some districts in the state that are fast growing. I think to be very candid, what we've seen is that with a lot of expansion of businesses moving to Tennessee, we've seen more fast growing districts over the last several years, even more than before. And so you think about Williamson County, Clarksville, areas, et cetera. There's lots of fast growing areas across the state. This provides additional funding for those fast growing districts. There has been, obviously it's targeted to those areas that are fast growing. That's where we've received more of that feedback, but it is something you currently fund now and has been noted as potentially a more accelerated need because of how many businesses and folks are moving into Tennessee. So happy to answer questions on that one. The tutoring, just to be clear, we had the the learning loss and student acceleration bill last year. It does require that those students who are not proficient on the 3rd grade TCAP, if they are at that below level, they must participate in the summer programming and in tutoring the next year. Because that was several years out, it's not considered in the current budget. This essentially says that there is some funding that we are able to put towards those 4th grade students who are required to participate in tutoring. Because of Tennessee All-Core, we've got 150,000 students over the first 2 years that are participating voluntarily. It has allowed us to look at what that number might be and what that cost might be, but it is a direct fund just for those students who are required by law to participate in tutoring. And then a lot of interest in CTE programs. I think across the state, we've had innovative high schools that have been funded through our federal recovery dollars, rethinking what high school can and should look like, really focusing on CTE, focusing on work-based learning and apprenticeships. What this would do is it would say we want to make sure that we can continue those programs. We don't have students graduating that are using outdated equipment. They then go into workforce, and workforce is telling us, yes, that would have been a really great skill if it were 10 or 15 years ago, but we're actually using this completely different equipment now. And so it does, I think one of the things I would want for you all to consider is what many states have moved to, and that is saying that there is a difference in types of programs. So there's something that we do, which is called high value, high demand. And those are jobs that pay a little bit more, where there's more industry need. You think about welding, you think about, frankly, I would say teaching as a profession, no surprise I'm gonna put that in there. You think about electricians and plumbers, and there's different needs in different areas. That is different than maybe some pathways that are not as in high demand or is not as high value, and we tier that. What states like Texas has done, Florida has done this. I would say we're probably about 25% of states. They've gone to a model. Indiana recently redid theirs, where more funding is provided for those industries that are high demand and high value. What other states have also done, they've said we'll put slightly less money in 9th grade. As the student progresses within their pathway, the student generates more funding for that pathway. What that does is it incentivizes completers as opposed to just participation. That has been a very significant shift across the country. There have been a couple of states who are leading in that, and they have just passed things in the last 12 months. Again, Texas and Indiana are the two that come to mind that have kind of based that out. Tennessee has always been a leader in CTE, and we have been national leading for a very long time. This would be a different way to approach it. It is very different than the BEP. It is not an entitlement where everyone is treated the same. It is the state saying, you know, the Department of Education, higher education, post-secondary, and industry come together every year. They have a tiered list of what those pathways are, high value, high demand to others, and it would fund accordingly. It incentivizes completers, and it incentivizes students being put in and going into pathways that are more likely to lead to high paying and in-demand jobs. Again, it's a shift in the industry. It is a shift in how states are thinking about it. We've gotten a lot of feedback on this. The baseline feedback is we need to make sure students are working with up-to-date and aligned equipment, resources. Last thing I'll say on this, and then certainly I will stop, but there's been a lot of feedback on educators in the CTE space. And so if I am in construction, and we were in Kingsport actually, and I remember getting this feedback directly from industry at a roundtable over the summer, and they said, why would I leave my job to make a lot less to go into teaching, to teach 2 or 3 courses? And so there has been some conversation nationally. Tennessee could be one of the first, if not the first state to do that. We have something called an apprentice teacher. It is essentially, or an adjunct teacher. It allows folks who are in plumbing or welding or something else to have one course. Maybe they're just teaching one course at the local school. It's not the same as teaching English or math. They don't do the praxis. They come in, they get some pedagogy training or training on how to teach the class. They're able to teach the class without all of the red tape and the hoops, and then they can still work in their chosen profession. The other benefit to that is that it ensures that there are people who are currently in the profession training our kids, as opposed to folks who have left the profession. It keeps us and our equipment, our services, our supports, our programs very, very up to date. That would be a policy change, but again, we've heard a lot of feedback to move us in a more contemporary direction in this space. So that's kind of these are the 3 main ones, and would love to hear more. Defer to
How would those kind of positions be funded?
So that is a policy decision. Thank you for asking that. That's a policy decision that you all can make. They could be on the same educator salary. It also, because it would be a different classification as an adjunct teacher, you could allow for districts to have more flexibility in how they fund those roles, whether it's to be more competitive with industry, or if it's just a part-time role. They teach 1 or 2 classes a day. This also does allow. Yes, and industry. Well, yeah, we could ask industry to pay for it.
Because you do have the issue, like you're talking about, people not wanting to leave a job that's paying a lot more.
That's right.
And so even if it's less time, salary could be a challenge.
That's right. And this allows flexibility. One of the pieces of feedback we've received on CTE is what we call expanded day. And so it is this idea that students don't have to do that in their normal 6-period day. If that's how the high school is operating, they could actually have expanded CTE. That's a 0 period. That might be an after-school class. By having an adjunct teacher and funding associated with that, it allows for students to have that expanded CTE opportunity. And folks, after their normal workday, then have the opportunity to come and deliver those courses, as opposed to interrupting maybe what their normal day and flow is. We have an issue of staffing in the CTE pathways. It is a massive issue across the state. It's a massive issue across the country. Just because it's not as competitive and everyone's competing for jobs, education just isn't as competitive salary-wise as maybe an electrician who's making $125,000 a year. We still want that knowledge and expertise to train our future electricians. And so being more flexible and contemporary in that, I think is potentially a really strong addition for us policy-wise.
What you're talking about is part-time. I mean,
Yes,
come
that's
in
right.
part-time, and I mean, look, pick up a few extra hours, teach the kids, based on what you're an expert in, and just come in. To me, I think that just makes sense. And I see no downside whatsoever, other than just make sure you can background check folks and everything else. But even somebody making $125,000 a year may want to pick up, some extra money and like actually bring their expertise into the classroom and just enjoy that.
And future employees, frankly. Like, we're hearing a lot of people who, there's just not enough people in the hiring pool.
Well, Farrell and I worked on a TCAT
And that's
in
why
our
I'm
district,
interested in it.
and that's a lot of what they utilize. I mean, they bring in folks, sometimes part-time and everything else. If the TCATs can do it, there's no reason why K through 12 couldn't, right?
We have been in a number of meetings with industry where you guys have got to help us figure out a way to train people. So, I mean, I think we're desperate enough for folks, to the salary point, that they would just continue to pay people their standard salary, but allow them an hour or 2 a day to.
But they're not gonna let them go like get full certification for teachers and go through all that expense and time and spend, 18 months or 2 years doing it. I mean, like, they're not gonna do that and do their full-time job.
Yep.
Most of them.
So this is not total program funding, but it is a hybrid between student funding and program funding, correct?
Yes, it's money that would be generated by the student, but it is for a specific activity. So this would be one of those things we say it's a funding plan, not a spending plan. This is where we're saying we are giving you funding as a state specifically because you are fast growing, that student generates that, or specifically because you are required to be in tutoring, or for CTE, it's because you are in a specific CTE pathway. So it would be for the student, but it would be for that purpose.
Okay. One of the things that's included here is materials, which looks to me like there would be a program funding issue on that, and facility also, perhaps. That where it's not just funding, student funding, which is what we're driving at, I got that. But is there not consideration also of program funding that matches that in some way, depending on what the program might be?
Absolutely, and I think there's two ways that we could go about that. I think one is you have the student generate the funding, and then at the aggregated amount that student generates allows for us to fund some of those programs. There's also an opportunity where there could be, just like we do now, specific grants, et cetera, that you could put towards CTE. One of the things this doesn't prevent are pilot programs and things you could do outside of any formula. You could certainly still continue to do that. I think the idea here is that the CTE students generate a certain amount of money. The district can use that money towards paying for the educator, materials and equipment the student uses, any expansion of those programs. Transportation's a big one to go to TCAPs or industry sites, et cetera. Yes, ma'am.
This is probably off target or tangential, but on the second portion of tutoring, I understand what we're talking about direct funding because we know these people, these students have scored below.
Yes, ma'am.
But I hope we're doing things, and I don't know how it's funded. Teachers know in first and second grade who is or who isn't, on track.
That's right.
So what are we doing as
Earlier.
Yeah.
So that is, I really love that. I love this topic, but a couple of the things that you're not seeing here that are in kind of the framework that came out on that backside is these additional considerations. One of those, and the biggest thing that we've seen to actually drive outcomes, has been having either smaller group pullouts, the tutoring during the school day for all of our students K through 2 before we get to the point where they're behind. What that typically looks like is that you have a classroom teacher and you have one additional support teacher. Maybe that teacher serves 1 or 2 classrooms during the day to be able to do smaller groups, high dosage tutoring during the day. From a fiscal note perspective, we put that as something for you all to consider, but to fund that is something significant. So we have that here. It's not in one of the kind of bigger things that we've heard in feedback. It is something we've heard as part of the smaller class sizes in the younger grades. That is the thing more than anything else that has driven improvement in K through 2. More time for reading and making sure that you have small groups to differentiate the needs for kids. That also addresses, I think, some of your points around dyslexia. A lot of that is you don't need additional supports if you actually have teachers who can get to 3 kids at a time versus 20 in kindergarten.
And to the chairman's point, early identification. If you figure it out, quicker it is, easier it is to address.
That's right. That's right. It's more expensive to address the longer that you don't address it. Outcomes, lots of feedback on outcomes. As you can imagine, I think we heard the feedback last committee about literacy and really focusing there. We did a 50-state summary and sweep of what other states have done on this. We also, I think Charlie had sent over a document that's going to the subcommittees as well about what other states do for outcomes. Very candidly, we have not found a solution to this outside of what other states who do something similar, and that is states like Arizona, Texas, et cetera. They use their state test in 3rd grade. That is something that is the solution we've seen nationally. We've kind of racked our brains for other solutions to present to you. We don't think the universal screener is an appropriate, that's not the appropriate tool to use for something like this because it is about growth and instruction and less about high stakes or accountability. We do use the 3rd grade TCAP for the retention bill conversation, that part of it to qualify for those additional services. It can be absolute proficiency or it can be growth. Those are some things that might be open to consider, but I know I was asked to come back and this group asked me to present on what other states do for literacy in terms of outcomes. Every state that does that does some version of their state test, whether it's growth or proficiency, and you've got that document. The other ones, I know there was a really strong focus on high school, so you'll see some of those. We've tied it to what our current accountability system includes. We also included ideas around CTE completers, work-based learning and apprenticeships, and FAFSA completion. We've got a lot of feedback on that. We did not get a lot of feedback on middle school. So again, middle school is a lot of, those of you who have kids, have been in schools, et cetera, know that it's a hard grade band. We lose a lot of kids, their engagement, and a lot of times their proficiency in those grades. Whether or not we want to include an outcome for the middle school grades is something we'd love feedback on. And then the third question is just around whether we want to do proficiency or growth.
Can you help me understand why FAFSA completion is included in this outcome?
These are all the ideas that we heard. We wanted to be inclusive of those. It was included as a way to incentivize FAFSA completion for all students. We've got regions of the state that have much higher percentages than others. So it was intended to be more of, let's make sure that that is across the board for all kids. So we included literally everything that we heard in outcomes because I didn't want to filter that out. I know this is really important part of the conversation. Yes.
I was gonna save it for feedback, but since you were talking about literacy.
Yes.
Back up there, I'd like to point out, on the 4-pager that was sent out a couple days ago on the framework, the draft framework on the 4th page, it had additional considerations supporting. The first was pre-K through 3rd grade. I would like to see us put a heavier weight on that area.
Yes, sir.
We have probably spent more time in our education committees the past 8 years addressing early childhood literacy. And if we could focus on that, we fix a whole host of problems from 4 through 12, as we all know. So I think that needs a heavy weight on early childhood literacy, the pre-K through 3rd grade. For that very reason, as we look at that, almost like it's a separate institution, because we need to fix, just like our 3rd grade retention. We're having problems with 3rd grade retention now, or reading rate 3rd grade. So that would advocate for that.
That's great. Thank you.
I want to speak in on that also. The pre-K, I think, is, to me, is extremely important. I know that there's quite a bit of discussion surrounding that. Give you some examples of how it's limited right now is that my county has 30,000 students. They had 2 pre-K, were able to get to 4, but they're limited on what they can do on that funding. Whereas I know of another county that has approximately 6,000 students, and they've got a dozen pre-K. And so there's a discrepancy across the state from district to district on that. There's lots of issues and questions. Capacity is one of them that comes into play, no question about that. But when I ran for this office about 10 years ago, one of the things that I said was, I'm tired of Tennessee being 47, 48, 9th in education. Well, we've moved out of that, and I'm real proud of that. But I'm also tired of 3rd grade, only 1/3 of them being proficient. And we can have a discussion about all that, but I think that this is really important. And if the pre-K currently is funded outside of this. Let's get it inside of this.
Along those lines, I've asked this question before. I mean, we get federal funding for daycare. We get to determine on many of these daycare institutions on what level of care they are providing, especially when they get into the pre-K years. The federal funding comes for that, but we have the authority to utilize those funds now. And quite frankly, I mean, we've been spending tens of millions of dollars on pre-K in Tennessee, that if we increase some of those standards on what daycares are required to provide as part of those federal programs, we almost get a lot of the pre-K goals that we would like, being able to utilize federal funding that's coming for daycare anyways, that is coming into our communities for that reason. And I want to echo what my chairman said about FAFSA completion. I have absolutely no idea why that would have anything to do with this whatsoever. If we're doing our job right, K through 12, and these children are doing a lot of dual enrollment and apprenticeships and work-based learning and everything else that they're doing, and by the way, a child may just come from a household where they don't want to fill out a FAFSA, that they choose to fund their child's education, or they go directly into a TCAT or a community college or a 4-year school and choose not to. Why would we punish a school because a parent chooses not to fill out a federal form?
I am I did a little cross out, didn't like that. So
Oh, all right.
I think that's part of what we want to get the feedback on. This is not to say our proposal in the final draft would include all of these. It really is to say, you all tell me this doesn't resonate, drop this, drop this, drop this. I don't think from a funding perspective, it makes sense to have all of these on a list. We just wanted to provide all of them. I know accountability and outcomes is something you all have said is really important for us to discuss. So I'm giving you all the options on the menu. So big old line through that. Yes, sir.
Just for clarity, and if I'm wrong, correct me.
Yes, sir.
I think where that came from, if you look at, when we're talking about CCTE, it says funding would be provided in areas of direct funding for participating students. FAST applications is a direct indication of the interest in that particular area, of how many are going on to higher ed. So I think that's where that came from, not that I'm questioning anything I'm saying, but that's where that's coming from.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Okay, I want to come back around to a couple of things.
Yes, sir.
One is that I did a visit in my district a few years ago and visited two. There were only two pre-Ks in the district. I visited one of them, basically the same school, and there was a Head Start program.
Yep.
Entirely different.
Mhm.
Entirely different. The Head Start, not only were they not instructing students, they didn't even have discipline. They weren't teaching them how to be socially correct in a situation. So it's really important that we have quality teachers in this arena. The second story is that where I attended church, we did a Mother's Day out and built a building. We were building a building anyway and had this in mind. So we built it to the specifications of the state where it met all the requirements. And then more stuff was added on. We wound up discontinuing that program. And we had qualified teachers there, but we discontinued that program because of the regulations the state put on. When I go back to capacity and facility use, public-private partnerships could be something that could work really well in this arena, where that if you relieve these entities of some of these needless requirements. I'm not talking about safety, but some of the needless red tape and requirements.
Great. Thank you very much. On outcomes, anything else that you all want to cut? You're just like, no, Penny, no. Or things that you like, things that you would say must stay. We'll send it back to the subcommittee and we'll ask them to just kind of prioritize what they think is most appropriate or not.
Sorry, one question.
Yes, sir.
Not necessarily cutting, but on all of the accountability measures that we have in place, and many of those are not listed here, obviously, but much of the testing that we're doing now, I mean, there's long been a conversation about streamlining that and making sure that that is efficiently and effectively coming back in a very timely manner. Much of that is not listed here. So are we going to continue to have some of the accountability measures that we have currently, or is
yes,
this an indication that we're going away from some of that?
No, this would just be fiscal accountability. So everything related to the academic components of that, nothing is changing there. This would just be what accountability do we want to have on the funding side? And it would be, do we want to have any way to incentivize by measuring these academic achievements or growth?
But these are, I mean, a lot of these though are later in the educational process and journey. So, I mean, we do lots of testing and we know, many of these schools, whether they're falling behind or not, I guess that's my question. I mean, when you're talking about K through 8, I mean, there's very little on this page that deals with, I mean, except for the top point, just saying literacy. I mean, are we going to be evaluating whether or not these schools are excelling in those areas and trying to incentivize and encourage those schools that may not be able to get up to par? Because there's really nothing on this page that I think addresses that.
It doesn't, and I think what we've seen is that in elementary, we just had the literacy component. That was something from last time. Most of the feedback we've received were on the high school and the end of high school. So I think what I'm hearing is we can bring you some ideas what other states have done in that later elementary and middle school space in particular. What we've seen is generally it's the state test. We haven't seen a lot of variance across states besides that, but we can do another pass, and I think you've got the document that says what some of those states do.
Okay.
On the last thing, just on accountability, you see this here, kind of the 3 big points. I do want to reiterate, we have not just a federal requirement, I'm always going to let you know what our federal requirements are, but we do have to report on spending and funding at the school levels. We say this is how much money goes into a school, this is how the school spent those dollars. Right now in our existing formula structure, that is really hard to pull apart because everything's done at the district level. And so what this does is it does generate a number based on the student enrollment at that school. It says this is how much money from your ADM or your membership this school has generated. This is how much money stayed at that school, and this is how those dollars were spent. That would all be part of the transparent reporting that would happen from a public transparency perspective. I think one of the things we've heard a lot of feedback on and discussion is the accountability on that. So if there's any initial feedback on additional ways that you would want us to have an accountability component to this, definitely want to hear that. If there's questions you want the subcommittee to wrestle with for us to bring back to you, happy to do that as well. Right now it is some kind of fiscal accountability report card. Again, that is required by the federal government. We can determine what that means for Tennessee. But if there's anything else that you want to make sure we include, I know we've talked about return on investment and making sure dollars are generating outcomes and growth. Happy to hear that feedback or questions I can give to the subcommittee.
I think to Luda's point earlier, if we could just find a way to actually know and be able to say, this is how much we're spending on this student in this school. I don't think a lot of Tennesseans would continue to say that education is underfunded in Tennessee. I'm not sure that they really understand the level of funding that's been provided per child. Again, because it comes from so many different pots in so many different ways, and I think there's, I'm not saying it's too much or not even enough, but I'm saying I think it would be really helpful for everyone to understand what kind of commitment the state has made to education.
Absolutely.
And it would clarify whether more spending equates to better outcomes or not, too, you know,
That's right. As a parent, I can right now, and this is some of the reporting that we've worked on in terms of getting that back fast, and I have an update for you on that. We're going to get it. If you didn't notice, we did have fall testing, and if you didn't get a call, I'm so happy to hear that. But
I love it when we don't notice.
I know,
You know, we're all, when our phones aren't lighting up, y'all are doing a great job.
Knock on wood and all that, but reporting is back to families, and so we will continue to make that quick. But now you can look and you can see your child, their trend data for achievement over time. Reporting's getting better and better. We should be able to, as a parent, I want to be able to know, and this is how much the state and the local are funding my kids. And so we should be able to report at that level. This allows us to do that. That transparency for a parent on achievement and trend of growth for my child and the fiscal investment is a completely different ballgame of what we have now. So I hope that we can move to that. I think the accountability, the report, the transparency, and how I can hold accountable my school system and myself is really important. We hope to get there.
Traffic at a 1 o'clock in the district.
Thank you,
So
sir. I
everybody have a good
appreciate you.
weekend.
Thank you.
Final exit ticket question, to use educator jargon, is on local contributions. Just want some direction from you all. Do you want to do that? Do you want us to consider that and give you some proposals for this year? Do you want us to continue to work on that? That's something we've gotten 50-50 feedback. Some people say, we want to know what the state's going to do and then develop what that means locally. Some people are like, just do the whole thing right now. We want to see it all together. I want to be able to direct our capacity as a department and the subcommittee's feedback. So preferences, we can also try to do both. Happy to do that. Yes, sir.
Let's see if this makes sense. In my opinion, I know the local portion is complex and it's very important, and the two kind of have to match up. However, I don't want to see us delay what the state can do while the General Assembly is in session. I would like for us to move forward with that. Now, am I correct? If we were to pass on the General Assembly, come up with something with the state fiscal portion, it would still be a year before it was, say, implemented if everything was going smooth. Could we use that year to work on what this thing even rolls out and on the local match? We could use that year then to get the answers. I just don't want us to stop because the local portion becomes an obstacle.
Yes, sir. So if we move forward with a proposal, you all consider that and passed it, then we would have a year of planning and preparation before the new formula would go into effect. Now, for the local contribution, I think what we would recommend is, if we said, let's take the next year to design exactly what that would be, we would still recommend a 5-year grace period to make sure that locals can make any adjustments they may need to make. We've started to run some of those calculations in terms of how many local areas actually spend well above and beyond the state minimum. That impact is not gonna be as significant if we did change that formula, but we still want to give that 5 years for that match to change for
Let me ask
planning.
the commissioner, do you see any issue with my comment on that, with that as far as?
I don't know enough about the local part, I think, to answer, but I don't see a problem from funding standpoint of going ahead and addressing what the state's side would be.
I share my chairman's zeal on wanting to try to, dive into this and get something done this year. But I will say, and Chairman, you said this, I mean, I don't know how you do that in a vacuum. If we're not going to address the partnership that we have with our local governments and really identify how much is being spent in each district and whether or not it's working well and everything else, I don't know that how you do one side of that without at least addressing the other and knowing what the future looks like in both. I mean, I realize we're back in session and it's a short time frame, but I'd be interested to see how that would look like if you don't do both at the same time. So
yeah.
5 years seems like a long time to me, but I understand that's to allow, our locals the time to be able to adjust, but at the same time, I mean, that's, and again, I hate to make it personal again, but, my little girl's 12 in 5 years, she's about to graduate, which freaks me out. But I mean, seriously, I mean, like, we're losing more time with our kids. I mean, back to my senator's point on, we made great ground in education in Tennessee, but that has, leveled off over the past 3 or 4 years, actually 4 or 5 years. And so we were rapidly improving, and now it's just kind of leveled off. We've held our own, but we've not improved in a few years to the level that we probably could.
We'll get you both.
But that seems like you're making a point of getting on with it.
Yeah, and I am. I mean, that's what I'm saying. I want to get on with it, but at the same time, if there is a possible way to try to get on with it and have that local aspect to it as well, because I'm going to tell you, it's a huge issue, just the, trying to figure out what the local match is and a fair evaluation of that. I mean, quite frankly, the reason I asked that question a while ago, what I've seen as part of that equation, both aspects of it, leaves a bit lacking on the assumptions it makes. I mean, nothing against those equations, but look, it puts locals in a very difficult position on the decisions they have to make and really ties their hand in some regards. And quite frankly, looks at some stuff that's a bit antiquated. So I don't know. I mean, again, yes, it's important to move forward. That 5 years is a long time, but somehow to be able to do all this together, I think is ideal.
So what I'll do from the department side is we will progress as if we are doing something same year, and then also provide, if this were to move forward, and also provide what it would look like if we were to move forward with just the state side and then do another year. So that gives you a couple of pathways to choose from. And again, I say all that couched in, we are still just in feedback and discussion. We're just kind of building as we get that feedback, so we have something to move with if and when that decision is made.
And I think if we don't have that, there's a public relations problem, if you will. The locals are feeling, to some extent, they're buying a pig in a poke. They don't really, we can't tell them what their commitment is going to be. So I think that makes it a difficult sell at home.
Yeah, thank you for that.
The other side of that is that we're talking about earlier that we're going to hold them harmless initially. Well, if we're talking about holding them harmless for 5 years, then what takes place with funding each year? Well, the buying power goes down each year. That's a consideration to think about also.
$1 billion just doesn't go.
Yeah. I appreciate, I know I kept you a couple minutes over. I appreciate y'all going through this. We've got some homework we'll send to you in short order, and then we will keep chugging along with subcommittees and public feedback.